Oh, I'm sailing that weekend.
Sailing? How much is it, Ken?
About 25 quid.
25 quid? Does that include shares in the course?
Oh, come on. It's in Tattersalls, 2 meals and a coach.
Yeah, I suppose so. It sounds good. Taxi's not here yet, Matt. Matty! That's the end of her old Matty, innit?
Don't forget, you can catch up on the latest in the Close each Tuesday and Wednesday at 8. And on Tuesday, we'll be meeting Roger's parents. Tonight on Channel 4, Upstairs, Downstairs, and Elizabeth's in the grip of a new passion.
Kaffirs, lively but unreliable. Some operators burnt their fingers in Vulcan oil. Beware of dabbling in Vulcan oil, Rose.
I'm sure I don't know what you see in all that. It sounds like a foreign language to me.
It is. Mr. Karakin is teaching it to me.
Oh? Thought you said you didn't like him.
He has got a sort of animal magnetism.
My mouth. His grey, green eyes. I find them strangely disturbing.
Rose said you'd want your pound of flesh.
Morning, Miss Elizabeth.
Scandal upstairs causes upset downstairs. Tonight at 10:15 on Channel 4. Back now to this afternoon, and after the break, Michael Charlton with 7 Days. His special guest, Michael Foote, talking about the late Arthur Koestler.
Think of the transatlantic airline that carries more passengers, more miles between the major cities of the USA. Think of the airline with more than 1,600 takeoffs and landings each day in America alone. Think of the airline that's consistently been voted #1 for service within the U.S. by the International Airline Passengers Association. Think of the airline that flies you non-stop Gatwick, Dallas, 7 days a week. Perhaps it's not surprising you're now thinking of American Airlines.
I love my cat Tiger, and I give him the best. I give him Whiskas. He likes the jelly, he likes the meat, he just likes everything about it. Texture is very good, very chunky. I prefer it for Tiger, and Tiger loves it for himself. He likes the firm, chunky pieces of Whiskas. He really likes something to chew at. I count value for money very important, and Whiskas is value for money because there is never, ever any waste, either in the can or on the plate. I recommend Whiskas to everyone who has a cat. I don't know what I'd do without it, quite honestly.
Fancy a weekend down the coast this Easter? Can't afford it? Well, I'm Richard Page from Swan National, and for less than £10 each per day in a party of 4, we'll rent you a car, arrange bed and breakfast, and give you extras, all for less than £10 each. 3, 4, or even 5 nights. The choice is yours. Swan National Easter breaks. Phone me on 01 388 1111 for details now. That's 388 1111.
A refreshing Servoflow shower, expertly fitted in just 1 day. Ring 01 388 1122. That's 01 388 1122. .
Tomorrow at 3 there's a special Irish angle called A Great Day for the Irish, which looks at the history of the Irish in America and the St. Patrick's Day Parade in New York. Well, it's 6 o'clock on a Saturday. That can only mean that it's time for Michael Charlton and 7 Days.
Good evening. This week the government gave us what may be a significant clue. Is the reprieve of Tadworth Hospital an indication of how it now sees the future of the welfare state? Elaine Hayman's guest this week is Dr. John Dunwoody, the chairman of the Bloomsbury Health Authority, an area of London where many of the ideals of the left in Britain first found expression. And the world of letters this week continued to take stock of a man who set out to bury the labor movement's romance with the Russian Revolution and with Soviet communism. The impact of Arthur Koestler, the author of Darkness at Noon, and his moral and political influence as a writer is assessed by his friend, admirer, and obituarist, Michael Foot, the leader of the Labour Party. The importance of the government's decision this week over the Tadworth Court Hospital for Children goes beyond the announcement that it's going to stay open. It's focused argument about the commitment in practice to the original principles of the National Health Service. Elaine Hayman.
Tadworth Court Hospital for Sick Children was saved this week in a glare of publicity and much self-congratulation from the popular press, the media and the Department of Health.
We have a reprieve.
No one could deny the campaigners for Tadworth their victory, or fail to be impressed by the quality of care the hospital obviously provides. But on another level, the decision about Tadworth is a worrying one. It's the first National Health Service hospital to be transferred to the voluntary sector since the inception of the health service in 1948. If the politically attractive parts of that service, the children's hospitals, the life and death specialist units, are to be hived off in this way, then what are the implications for the less newsworthy, financially deprived areas of healthcare that remain in the public sector? And what about the whole elaborate structure of decision-making within the NHS? Last year, health authorities went through another painful round of reorganisation, aimed specifically at setting up both clear managerial lines of command and democratic channels of decision-making. How can the new authorities carry out their duties of allocating resources and setting priorities within their own areas if the Department of Health is likely to step in and reverse every unpopular decision that's ever made? And in an age of ever-increasing demands, how can anyone decide between the competing claims for respite care for dying children, or bone marrow transplant units, or cancer screening programs, or a better incontinent laundry service for the housebound? In our London studio is Dr. John Dunwoody, a GP, a former junior Minister of Health under the late Richard Crossman, and the chairman of the Bloomsbury District Health Authority in London. Dr. Dunwoody, The Guardian described the decision over Tadworth this week as a triumph for everyone except for the ghost of Nye Bevan. Do you think that's a fair comment?
I think it is in some ways a fair comment. One is a little bit concerned if this were to be the beginning of a trend by which parts of the health service were hived off to outside organisations. I think there's a very real place for cooperation between voluntary organisations who've got certain groups of patients as their concern and the health authorities. But if we're really going to maintain a comprehensive nationwide service for all the community, I think it's got to be controlled and financed by the community as a whole, through the National Health Service, through the Department of Health and through the health authorities.
One feels that £890,000 was suddenly found by the Department of Health, which has refused it for many other groups in the community, for Tadworth. Is there always going to be that sort of bias towards the politically attractive cause?
Well, I suppose there always is going to be a bit. It's human nature in some ways. The problems of sick children are problems that strike a sympathetic chord in most people's minds. It's the acute services, the casualty services, the day-to-day services, treatment of diseases like cancer, small children, maternity care. These are the sort of things that the general public sort of readily has sympathy for if they're being threatened. We don't get people marching down the streets with banners waving for the psychogeriatric patients or for the long-stay patients in our large psychiatric hospitals, or even for our geriatric patients.
So does that put a very special responsibility on the health authorities, if you like, to be the spokesman of the guardians of the interests of the groups who don't have the vocal support?
I think we've got a special responsibility in respect of the large number of inarticulate patients in the community who don't have all that many people speaking up for them. I'm thinking of the sort of patients in our long-stay hospitals who perhaps are never visited by a relative from one year's end to the other. It's the professionals in the health service who've got the responsibility in those sort of cases.
And is there some sort of double standard in the public response? Because you get publicity over long-stay mental handicap hospitals, for example, about abuses that go on there. And there's a great deal of horror and hands in the air and how awful this is that one nurse is in charge of 60 patients or whatever. And yet somehow the £890,000 of this world aren't found for those long-term causes.
Well, I think that's true, and I've got an enormous amount of sympathy for the staff in our large long-stay hospitals, psychiatric hospitals, mental handicap hospitals. I think they've taken a terrible battering in recent years, and their morale is very low. And I think if the public had some understanding of the sort of tasks that they have to do, it would be a good thing. But it's not easy because most people don't have any personal direct experience of that sort of health care, whereas people do understand children's illnesses.
Will you ever, do you think, be able to shift people's priorities to those sorts of areas, to preventive medicine, where many people would argue that money could be better spent, when there's this inbuilt prejudice in the system for what already exists, the institutions that already exist? There'll always be a campaign to save a hospital, won't there?
Well, I think it's the responsibility of the health authorities to see that this shift takes place, and I believe it is possible. In my own authority, for example, we will be building up a fund of around £1 million every year for our priority services, and that means services for the elderly, for the psychiatric patients, for the mentally handicapped, community services. Now, those resources have got to come out of the acute sector that so often attracts the sympathy of the public. The sector that's been growing willy-nilly in recent years in the health service is going to be a difficult and painful exercise. I think it can be achieved, but it's part and parcel of the whole business of making the service more cost-effective than it's been in the past.
But isn't yours, in a way, an impossible job, both as a chairman and corporately as an authority? How can one ever measure the different needs of different groups of people below an absolute level of need? I mean, the children who need kidney transplants, the patients at home waiting for psychogeriatric beds, the people who aren't being screened for cancer, they all need a service that you haven't got the money to provide and the resources to provide for all of them. I mean, how can you differentiate between them?
I think it's very difficult, and this is the task of the health authority and the members of the authority. It's a question of balancing priorities. One has information from people working in the service, one has statistics, one knows of demands from the community, one takes all of these things into account. We inherit a historic position and we look to the future and see how the balance between the services should be shifted. And I think it should be shifted out of the acute sector into the long-stay sector, out of the hospitals into the community. But having said all of that, at the end of the day, there's very personal factors I suppose we all use. Personally, one of the things I use is my experience in my day-to-day work in a fairly typical inner-city general practice. And I see my patients as a sort of microcosm of the community in the inner city, and I judge very often the way in which we ought to be moving in our health authority by the sort of problems that my patients have to face in a very similar patch in inner London. But that's perhaps a personal advantage that I've got because I'm a chairman and a GP.
Dr. Dunwoody, thank you very much indeed.
Long before his death, a few days ago, Arthur Koestler, who was Hungarian-born and a former communist, was considered to have written one of the most important books of this century. Darkness at Noon was his masterpiece. When it was published in 1940, it caused something of an intellectual explosion, and in the words of an Englishman of the left, John Strachey, it broke friendships and it split families. Darkness at Noon became the official textbook of those disillusioned with the outcome of the Russian Revolution. The book turns on the central question of why the accused in Stalin's show trials confessed. If one assumed that they were made to confess by the use of terror alone, one was saying that only one set of revolutionary leaders was to blame. But Koestler came to the conclusion that these people were rotted, as George Orwell said, by the revolution that they served. That revolution itself was a corrupting process, and that therefore Lenin led directly to Stalin, inevitably so. And that was the darkness of what should have been Noon. Koestler set out to rid the world of its illusions and to insist how vital were the Christian and humanist values which had civilized the West were, and to expose what Orwell called the besetting sin of left-wingers who wished to be anti-fascist without being anti-totalitarian. Michael Foot, the leader of the Labour Party, was his friend, who considers Koestler to have been the greatest foreign-born writer of English since Joseph Conrad, and a man who had an immense influence on the thinking of the left in Europe. Mr. Foot, how should we understand and how should we value the significance of Koestler's influence on the left and on the labour movement in Britain?
Well, I suppose the biggest influence that he ever had on most of us was the Darkness at Noon, and very few people can forget reading Darkness at Noon, and those of us who read it in the early 1940s, just after it had been published, it was a sensational effect. And that effect, I think, went on. It wasn't until after the war, actually, that the circulation of Darkness at Noon went all over Europe, and I think it had a huge influence there, too, because I think it gave the clearest, the most deadly, the most effective explanation of the Soviet trials, and that changed the attitude of a lot of people to the whole of the Stalin system.
Writing about it a couple of years ago, you said that it was an indelible moment for you, because with it, a terrifying shaft of darkness was cast over the past as well as the future, you said.
Well, I think that that's what it had, and that was the meaning of it, and I think that shaft still goes on in a sense. Of course, my memories of him, the book and reading him, was all mixed up with the personal meetings with him, and they were pretty unforgettable too, because we used to argue about everything under the sun. I tried to get him to write a column, or indeed he very eagerly agreed to write a column for the Evening Standard called I'm Sidney Sand, Your Neighbour on the Underground, and it was a very brilliant and funny and witty and salacious column in a sense, and it was the last quality that seemed to offend some of my managers or proprietors at the time, and so the column didn't continue very long, although my arguments with him continued all through the war, and indeed for a period afterwards. He then went on to apply the same absolute overwhelming powers of argument and exposition in other fields, and he was exploring different forms of knowledge with an absolute relentless honesty, and all those qualities went with it too.
I'm interested, you say, though, that a shaft of darkness over the future, because he did set out, didn't he, to destroy the myth of the Soviet Union as a benevolent and developing democracy. Now, was the shaft of darkness over the future, as you put it, a shared doubt with him that he may not have been successful in doing that?
Well, he was an absolutist in the way he used to think, and in one sense, I suppose that's why he became a communist, and when he ceased to be a communist, he went into the opposite extreme. Some other people who had been communists and ceased to be communists didn't go to the lengths that he did. For example, Ignazio Siloni, who I think was even greater than Koestler in the way in which he analyzed the Stalinite horror, but also didn't lose his allegiance to democratic socialism, and I think in that sense Siloni was greater than Koestler. Koestler paid great tribute to Siloni too, and to George Orwell, who of course had never himself been a communist, but whose writings about Stalinism had an enormous effect, and maybe an even greater effect than Koestler's own. But if you take one artistic achievement in the whole anti-Stalinite or anti-communist writing, I think Darkness at Noon comes out the absolute top.
But did you share Koestler's conclusion that revolution itself is a corrupting process, that the means that the Soviet revolution set out to employ led inevitably to the sellers of the Lubyanka, that Lenin would have become Stalin? I mean, that there was no difference between the two.
No, I don't share that conclusion, because I think there were quite a lot of other people at the time of Lenin who took a different view too, and who, if they had been left to guide events, then it would have had a different outcome. For example, Rosa Luxemburg, who never lost her faith in democracy. It was the departure from democratic principles which caused the distortion of Stalinism. Now,
why do you stop short of that conclusion of Koestler's there yourself?
Well, because I think he carries it to the extreme, just as if you look at when he writes about some other things, he almost, I don't say he became a mystic in the end, but he didn't, because he's held back from that. But he almost abandoned his allegiance to reason and to the whole of the liberal virtues. I'm not saying that in any personal reflection on him. I think his mind took him to extremes naturally, and I think to that extreme was a very dangerous one, and there were quite a number of other people who held back from that. As I say, anyone who reads the books by Siloni will see that he went through the same kind of experience in the Communist Party that Koestler had gone through, but he drew different, and as I believe, much more hopeful and beneficent deductions from his experience.
Gives me a chance, though, to quote you something Koestler wrote, or at least Dick Crossman, Richard Crossman. After all, you and Crossman were the two who sponsored Koestler's naturalization in Britain, weren't you? And Crossman wrote in the introduction to The God That Failed this, if I may quote it to you, either you can't or you won't understand, he says to Crossman. It's the same with all you insular, Anglo-Saxon, anti-communists. You hate our Cassandra cries and resent us as allies. But when all is said, we are the only people on your side who know what it's all about. Now, he might have said the same to you.
Well, he did, maybe did say
what would you have said?
Well, I could reply in actual detail, because I remember he used to say those kind of things when he went to the Berlin... when he went to the anti-communist
Peace Congress.
Yes, in 1950, but there was another socialist there who was more far-seeing than Koestler, because he was applying his democratic socialist principles over a period. Willy Brandt. Now, Willy Brandt has had a bigger influence on the development of post-war Europe than the Koestler ideas. Koestler was saying at that conference, if you don't accept my full doctrine, you're not going to have any influence on the way in which Europe develops, whereas Willy Brandt and people who were not prepared to go to his extreme lengths in the interpretation have had a much bigger effect. And so the democratic socialists and those who were never seduced by the full communist doctrine, in my opinion, have had a much bigger effect on shaping the kind of Europe in which we live than Koestler did, or some of those who thought like him. And another example...
No wonder he said Cassandra has grown hoarse. He must have despaired of you, perhaps.
No, well, he did, but you see, Cassandra wasn't always correct. You have to listen to the Cassandras and take their warnings, but you then maybe find out a different path.
You lament the other day in something you wrote about him that he didn't address the final dilemma of our age, the final dilemma of the nuclear age. We had one argument about dropping the bomb, you said, and I still can't determine how